Um, Thanks everyone for coming today. There will be no slides. Everything that I will do will be live. And when we move to the second part of this, where we actually walk through how to do some scraping with Twitter, you should be able to follow through in the notebook as well if you have a Google account. And we'll get into how to do that. So we're talking today about Twitter and how to scrape it. And so I'm going to share my screen with you right now, and we're going to go to developer.twitter.com. I'm going to drop that into the chat here, and it should show up. For each of you there. So I'm going to share my screen, and it'll take a minute for it to, maybe not a minute, but a few seconds to come on up. So when the screen share shows up for you, what you should see is the kind of splash page on developer.twitter.com. You can also get there with dev.twitter.com. So we're going to start here because we need to understand some things about Twitter for us to scrape them. And the piece that I'm going to talk about here are the products. So along the top of the splash page, there it says developer, so you know you're in the developer section. It then says use cases and then products. And underneath products, the very first menu item here is products overview. And so I'm going to click that, and it's going to show us the different ways that we have of accessing Twitter. So this will bring up a page, and the title should say APIs and tools to tap into what's happening. And an API is an application programming interface. It's just a fancy way of saying a really long, complicated URL. So if you've ever done a search with Google or with Amazon or even on Facebook, as you start getting deeper and deeper into pages, you'll see all sorts of different characters and code words that are showing up in your address bar. APIs are a fancy way of creating those and passing them to a service. In this case, the service would be Twitter, along with your credentials in the background that say you have permission to access those pages, and then receiving a response from that. And so what we're going to do with Twitter is we're going to build those, and we're going to use some fancy tools to do that. So I'm scrolling partway down the page now, and you should see a title towards the top of the screen here that says data products, and in the middle of that is a little chart that says scale your Twitter data access. And there are three sections to this. The first is the standard API. And so this is application programming interface that makes those fancy URLs that's free. Right? And with the standard API, you have the ability to capture tweets from the stream, and that means so you can capture live tweets, so you're filtering. So you could set up a little application, and you'll see how to do this later, where it's just watching. And so if you wanted, I don't know, hashtag pumpkin pie or something like that, it would watch, and when pumpkin pie came up, it would grab the tweets that had hashtag pumpkin pie in them. Perhaps you have an American Thanksgiving theme or something like that. The other thing you can do with the standard API is you can search back 7 days. So there's a 7-day archive that you can get access to with the standard API. That 7-day archive is constantly shifting. So a tweet moves into the 7-day archive roughly 30 seconds after it's created. And at the same time, tweets are being kicked out on the other side. So it's this moving window. So if you need to go back just a few days, you can use the standard API to do it. And it doesn't cost you anything. The premium API, you'll notice if you can zoom in here, or you have your own browser window open here because you're following along that way, you'll see it has free to $2 signs. There's a free option here called a sandbox, and you'll see a little bit more about this in a moment. The premium APIs, there's two of them. One of them allows you to go back 30 days, and the next one allows you to go back through the full archive, all the way back to the very, very first tweet. If you're only using the sandbox, which is typically the case in most academic settings, there's going to be some throttling in terms of the number of requests that you can make to each API per month, and how many requests or how many tweets you can get back in total. So I'm going to move in just a moment to show you what that looks like. So if you're looking to only go back 7 days, you can use the standard API. If you're looking to filter real live tweets, you can use the standard API. Another caveat with the standard API, you can't just sit there and grab every single tweet that's coming through. If you're using the standard API, it's going to give you some number of tweets that hit your hit or hit the search term you're after. You can come up against some throttling here. So it will not give you more than, let's say, 1% of what's available in some cases, right? So if you're hashtag Trump, which I have in my examples, which you'll see, you might see it be the case that we get throttling and it kicks us out. And that's because we're trying to grab too much all at once, and it's going to reject us. So that's what's available. The other thing that you get, so then we have this premium APIs, they're fine, a 30-day or full archive, but they're also limited in another way. The length of your request is truncated, particularly with the sandbox. So if you need to ask for a whole lot of variables, I need tweets from this date to this date that have this word but not this word unless they have this word. These sorts of requests get very, very long, and Twitter's going to reject them. If you need to make requests like that, then you either need to be very clever and make some smaller requests and then assemble them, or use them to filter out, or you're going to need to start paying. And paying can get pretty expensive pretty quick. We're talking thousands of dollars a month. In the premium API section alone, you can be charged, or you can choose to pay. And if you want full access with really premium ability to really target things and to get everything, then you're really looking at the enterprise APIs. And there's not even a price listed for that. It's just call us. So that's the background here in terms of what products are available. Today I will show you standard and I'll show you premium and how to use and how to scrape them. On the top of this window, we have the standard menu items on the left: use cases, products, docs, more, and labs. On the right, there's a tool called dashboard, and then there's my name, and there's a search option and a little icon. I'm going to click on the dashboard option now. It's just loading up here for me. And what the dashboard is going to do is it's going to allow you to see your use for the current month. What you're seeing here is my use for the current month with the premium API. So in the top here, I've got search tweets 30 days, and this is part of my sandbox. There's a little kind of donut-y pie chart thing here. It says I've done 0 of 250 possible searches. That's your sandbox limit. I currently haven't done any this month. I only really use it for training, so I haven't done any for a while, so that's why it's low. And if you look just to the right of this, first on the left side is requests usage. How many requests have you made? How many times have you asked Twitter for some information? And then there's the tweets usage to the right of that. How many tweets have been returned from each of those asks? You're only allowed for the 30-day to ask 250 times over the course of the whole month, and then it just hard resets itself back down. There's no rolling reset here. It's 250 tweets per calendar month. And the largest number of tweets you're allowed to get back is 100 tweets per request for the 30-day. And so that's why you can have up to 25,000 tweets that you can pull back. And so if you needed 50,000 or 100,000 tweets over the 30-day, well, it might take you some time to build that up. The full archive is underneath. Here you can see that your requests usage is less. You can see that you can only make 50 requests to the full archive per month. And then to the right of that, the tweets usage, again, the maximum number of tweets that they will return to you per request is 100. So the largest number of tweets that you can pull out of the full archive each month is 5,000. So if you're thinking of planning a scraping project, you certainly want to grab stuff as it's coming out of the filter right away through the stream. Then you want to start grabbing it out of the 7-day archive as best as you can. Then you want to try and grab 30-day archive because you have 250 requests a month there. You can pull 25,000 tweets out, and once it moves into the full archive, then you've got less available to you. So that's the background for what's available with the APIs and what you can hope to scrape there. So I'm going to shift now into how you're actually going to do this scraping. The very first thing that you need to make this even possible is a developer account. And so you can get this by going to developer.twitter.com. If you don't have a developer account, you won't be able to see the things that I'm showing you here, but you will be able to request one of these accounts. The turnaround time on requesting one of these accounts is usually 24 to 48 hours. Sometimes it's less. And as an academic researcher, you can get access to these developer abilities. So fill in the form and put in your request. Sometimes people get worried about certain kind of security or privacy things or so on. Just be upfront, this is for academic work and research. Twitter is trying to take a stance here, so it's not just bots that are being created. And that's really why this form is there and this filtering process, which seems to have been pretty light so far. So once you have your account, you'll get a dashboard like this. But more importantly, on the top right here, beside the dashboard menu item, there's My Name. And if I click My Name, there's a Getting Started option. Then there's a subscription option, which we're going to ignore for now. And then underneath this, there's a thing called Apps. So I'm going to click on Apps. Once you have your developer account, you have the ability to create apps or applications. This should probably be called application descriptions, because the things that we could create here and that you're seeing, you should see 3 here on my page. You should see one called DH Event, another called DHSC Test, and then the one at the bottom called WestGrid Workshops. These are descriptions of tools that I've created elsewhere that have access or should have access to the Twitter API. So, and you can create one of these just by clicking the Create an App button in the top right corner. You need to create this app because it's going to create a bunch of keys for you. So I've just clicked the Create an App option, and it asks you for a name for it, a short description, a website URL. You may not have one of these. You can, for your URL, it could be the URL for your department homepage at your university, or perhaps a personal homepage for you as well. Some people just put in their university account, and you can fill this information in. Pay attention to the mandatory stuff. The other stuff you can leave blank. I'm going to go back to the general apps page and show you what it looks like when one of these has been filled in. So I have the WestGrid Workshop, and I'm going to click the details page on the right. When this loads for you, you should see a list that looks like all the pieces from that previous form, right? And you can see that some of these are just left blank. Like I don't have a privacy policy URL and so on and so forth. But I do have a website URL, much as the WestGrid app. Apparently I chose Company Canada, but that's fine. What matters once you create the app, at the top of the screen it says App Details, and then it says Keys and Tokens. What you care about here are the keys and tokens. So I'm going to click on that option, right? And you'll see that we have 4 really long character alphanumeric strings, right? These are part of the credentials that are needed to access the API. And so when you create the app, it's really here on Twitter, it's the application description. Then when you write your code elsewhere, and I'm going to show you how one way to write it in Python in just a moment, you're going to need to take these keys and tokens and you're going to need to inject them into your code. And so this is how you get those. You create your developer account on Twitter. You then once you've logged in, you should have the option under your name in the top right corner to select an app. Well, come to the apps page, and once you're in there, you're going to create an app. And as soon as that app's created, and it happens right away, you get the keys and the tokens. Should also notice here that there's an option to regenerate these keys and tokens. You know, you could be scraping the screen right now. You could be grabbing my keys and tokens. I'm actually going to give you the opportunity to use my keys and tokens during this workshop. And that's okay, because when I'm done this presentation, I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to click regenerate, and right away there's going to be a new key and token. You're not going to be able to see it. My account's going to be locked down and secured again, and you're still going to have a good learning experience. So that's something that you can do here as well, and it's a really nice feature. So that's a little bit about the products that are available to you, Standard API and Premium. Standard gives you 7-day and drawing from the stream. Premium gives you 30-day access and full-day access. And this is how you create your app, or at least your application description, and get the keys and the tokens. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to change over to a tool called the Google Collaboratory. I'm going to paste this URL into the chat window here. Try and paste it in the chat window. Sorry, I'm going to have to unshare my screen, paste it in, and then I'm going to share my screen again. So it should be in the in-call chat for you now. I'm going to share my screen again. So, and I'm just going to get rid of the windows here right now. So the Google Collaboratory, what is this? This is a place for you to write and run code in the cloud. I'm going to use the Google Collaboratory today because it makes it very easy for you to follow along with me if you have a Google account with your institution or perhaps separately. When you log into the Collaboratory, just like logging into Google Anywhere, the intent here is that we can share code very easily, and you can actually run that code on Google servers. So it's a really nice place to do development. You can even have access to some GPUs, graphics processing units, for some very short periods of time if you needed to do machine learning or AI work. It also has a really nice feature as well, and that it allows you to plug into other repositories where data is stored. So I say other because you could draw from Google Drive, but you can also draw from GitHub, and that's what we're going to do today. So I'm logged into the Google Collaboratory. I'm going to click File, and I'm going to choose to open a notebook. And when I choose to open a notebook, I get this orange menu barred box. There's an option for examples. There's some recent stuff. There's Google Drive if I had things. And then the fourth option here is GitHub. So I need to enter a GitHub URL or search by organization or user, right? And so we have one called UAlberta. I'm at the University of Alberta. -RCG for Research Computing Group. So I'm going to type that here into the GitHub URL search, and I'm going to press enter, and it's going to go to GitHub, find all the repositories there that are open and available for public sharing, and it's going to give me an interface here to interact with them. The very first one that comes up here is ualberta-rcg/Twitter_scraping. And that's the one that we want. Now, if that's not what you're seeing on your screen and you're following along, you can click the little up-down arrow to the right, and you can see there's a number of other things here as well. So if you're interested in an AI ethics workshop, we have one of those, and you can grab all that stuff as well. It's all free and available, and we'll probably be running some other webinars on some of these other topics in the future. So I've got Twitter scraping, that's the repo, and then underneath is a list of all the files that are available in that repository. I only have one file available in that repository. It's called Twitter Scraping for Researchers, a walkthrough, and at the end it says IPYNB. It's an IPython notebook. That's the earlier file extension for what are now known as Jupyter notebooks. So I'm going to click on that one, and it's going to bring up for me a Jupyter Notebook environment with this notebook loaded. The original one's still on GitHub. I can't wreck it or break it. It's safe there, but I can play with it here with you, or you can follow along and play with it. So I've clicked on it, and now it's going to GitHub. It's going to grab that notebook. It's going to give me, in this browser window, that notebook. So we're just waiting for it we're waiting a moment here for it to lay out the notebook and render it for me. So you should just be seeing a gray screen right now. Well, we see this gray screen, a couple notes on Google Collaboratory. It's a really nice feature, it's a really nice tool, has some nice features. There are some hiccups that happen from time to time. One of them is that you can just get kicked out, particularly if you're not using your notebook for a period of time, because these servers are shared. They're trying to give everybody enough space to do their work. It can save your notebooks. You can save them in Drive. It'll hold on to stuff in the Collaboratory for a couple days before it kind of gets pushed out. So please remember to save your work. And if you do get kicked out, just log back in, and you should be able to pick up where you got left off. So this is the Jupyter Notebook. Quick summary of Jupyter Notebooks, in case you haven't seen them before. They're drawing on this kind of notebook theme that's kind of taking hold in academic work as well as elsewhere. There's two major cell types. A cell is a block, right? So here at the very top, it says Introduction to Twitter Scraping for Researchers, and there's a whole lot of text here, right, that's describing what this notebook's meant to do. And you can see that there's hyperlinks in this text. So cell type number 1 is kind of a text block, and you're allowed to write regular text in there, and it will render it like it was a HTML. It's done with a language called Markdown. It's pretty easy to learn. You can look it up. We're a little tight on time in these workshops, so I'll set that aside, but that's how you interact with those. And if you wanted to interact with it in this notebook, you can click on it twice, and you could then edit that text. The other type of cell block is immediately underneath this, and it has exclamation point, and then it says PIP or pip, space, install space, a thing called Twitter API. And these are code blocks. And so you can actually run code from this notebook. So what's happening here with these Jupyter notebooks is you can write your text, and you can share your code, and you can write other text, and that text can be explanation about what's happening, descriptions, you can drop in images, etc., etc. And so rather than having a dead PDF that you would just read, or even perhaps worse, just some papers, or an old book where you would have to read it and then figure stuff out elsewhere on your own, it's bringing everything together. And you can take this one step further, and you can use a binder to have your notebook plus your data all bound together, so that when you share your research work, you're not just sharing some text or some dead code that somebody would have to type out on their own. You're sharing a really live workbook that people could then say, well, what would happen if we changed this variable? Or I'd like to search for that term instead of the one that's in the sample. What happens when I do that? And you can do it all in that notebook. And so there's a strong argument that's being made right now that this is where academic publishing is going to go, particularly where computers are involved, because the visualizations are embedded in the notebook. You can, even if they're dynamic, the data is embedded with the binder. So there's no question about, well, where'd you get those numbers from? And so one of the reasons I'm using it today is it's going to give you that flexibility. This notebook will remain open for you after this webinar is done, and it'll stay on GitHub, and I'll continue to update it over time. And because it's on GitHub, you could even offer some updates too, and I'd merge them in if you were interested. So that aside, let's look at scraping Twitter. The first cell at the top, bunch of overview things here. What really matters here is that you've these 6 points. I'm assuming you've got some familiarity with the Jupyter Notebook environment. You'll see what you need for that in this webinar. You need some functioning Python environment. Google Colab provides that, so you don't have to worry about it yourself. You do need a developer account for the purposes of this webinar and a few minutes thereafter. You don't, because you can use my keys, but they'll get locked down pretty quick after. You need to have the app created, as I showed you on the Twitter dev site. Later on in the workshop, later on in this workbook, it starts to move into looking at how you would interact with a database. If you're going to be pulling a lot of data down from Twitter, you're not going to want to store it in a plain text file or a flat file, as it's sometimes called. You're going to want to put it into a database. It's going to give you richer search and the ability to, well, just do richer things with your data. So it talks about MongoDB, which is a very nice database for working with Twitter, because MongoDB thinks and works in terms of JavaScript object notation, which you'll see what that is in a moment, because that's what Twitter is going to return tweets as. That part of the workbook is not complete right now. It's coming. So the last thing, number 6, super important. I really need you to pay attention to the warnings around the cells that are code cells. If you're not reading those and you're just click, click, click and run everything, it's going to fail for you. And I promise that will be the case. So check those. So that said, the very first thing we need to do is we need to install a library. On top of the Python implementation that Google is running here for us. And so we can do this in our first code cell, and an easy way to do that with the Jupyter Notebook is there's a little arrow. If I hover or click on top of the pip install Twitter API cell, and I can click on that. If you're not familiar with Python or interacting with the command line on Python, that exclamation point at the beginning says, don't run this in Python, go behind the scenes to the operating system level and run this command, pip. Pip is the Python package manager, and then I want you to go there, run that program, and install a library called Twitter API. Twitter API is a library that's available on GitHub. You can see a link to it just above. It's unfortunately named because Twitter Space API is the API that Twitter uses, and Twitter No Space API is a library written to use the Twitter Space API. So there can be some confusion there. Anyways, we need to install it. So I'm going to click the arrow, and it's going to tell me that Google didn't author this notebook. It's a little bit of a warning. You should see it on your screen. I'm going to say run it anyways. Now, you should see some spinning around what was the arrow, and you should start to see a number of text lines filling out this code block as it runs. And so it tells me a whole bunch of requirements are already satisfied. It's downloaded some things, and at the end, it should tell me that it's successfully installed Twitter API 2.5.1. This is one library that you can use to scrape Twitter. There are a number of libraries you can use to scrape Twitter. There's another one, called Tweepy or Tweepy, depending on how you want to pronounce it. They all have their pluses and their minuses. I'm using this one because it's fairly straightforward. It's pretty powerful. Hasn't been updated in about 2 years, but Twitter hasn't really changed their API in about 2 years, and it does most of the things that most people seem to need. And if it's not quite what you need, it's still a great way to get started. So that's why we're using it. So what we do when we install it is it's like going to the library and or a bookstore and buying the book or taking the book out from the library and then adding it to our shelf at home. So that's step 1 in order to use the library. Step 2 in order to use the library is this next little code block here that says from Twitter API, import the Twitter API, right? So this is going to that book that we just got from the library, the bookstore, and it's putting it on our table and opening it up so it's able to work for us. So we're going to run this as well. You notice that when we run this one, there is no output. This is a principle of silence is golden. It just ran, didn't complain, so it's good and it's done. So we now have a library that's going to help us create these really long, complicated URLs that are really the way that we interact with the application programming interface. So scrolling down a little bit further, there's now a large section on authentication. I'll summarize this for you. I'll leave the rest here for you to read on your own, since you should have access to these notebooks. Even if you don't have access to the Google Collaboratory, you can still go to GitHub and look at Alberta-RCG and look in there for the Twitter scraping content, and you can read it there. So, two types of authentication with Twitter. One they call OAuth 1, and another they call OAuth 2. OAuth 1 is what we're going to use today. OAuth 1 gives you access to streaming tweets, right, and the other tools that we're going to make use of. What it doesn't allow you to do is post as yourself, right? So with the application programming interface, you could write a Twitter bot, right? So this little robot program that might watch and see whenever anybody comments on a topic, could be ice cream or pumpkin pie or a political thing, and then through some background mechanism decide what it wants to say, and then use that API to then post a tweet and reply. Hey, I really like ice cream too, give me a call, or that was such a great event, or whatever it might say. We don't need that so we're going to use OAuth 1 today. You can see a list of what you can do here. You can do more with OAuth 2 in some sense. It's more powerful, but it's a narrower range of things that you can do. Here we have a list of, here we have another cell block underneath this, and it has 4 lines. One starts with API key, another API key secret, et cetera, et cetera. And so what's in here are those keys and tokens that were inside the Twitter developer page. So I'm just swapping my screen back here so you can see the Twitter developer page, and you see these consumer API keys and these access tokens. They, in the notebook, if you're following along, are copied exactly over from here, except I did some salting in advance of this workshop. I added 1 character onto the end of each of these. Just delete it, right? So API key should end with a lowercase t as opposed to, I think it was a lowercase I before. And same for each of the others. You need to keep the single quotes in here because these are strings. And we want to say everything inside these quotes, except I added 1 extra character. Take off the very last one, and this will work for you. We're going to load each of these long strings into this shorter name to the left of it. So yeah, the very first line, all that long jumble of text, will then, I'll be able to summon it just by API _KEY, API key. So I'm going to run this. Again, silence is golden. It runs really quick. You see a quick little spin around the arrow, and it's loaded. When I come down here to OAuth 1, right, and notice this important cell block here, right? So these are the sorts of things you have to track. Because if you're not, eventually if you're just clicking through and you're not reading these, you're going to get some errors and you're not going to know why. So I'm going to run the OAuth 1 block. Okay. And what this is going to do is it's going to create me a little authentication object. And so it's going to have everything that I need to access the Twitter API in one API object that I can use in just a moment. When people don't read the notebook, they just run OAuth 1 and then they run OAuth 2. Well, OAuth 2 doesn't do everything that OAuth 1 does, but it can do some other things. So there's things in this notebook that OAuth 2 can't do. Don't run the next set of cells. It's not going to work well for you right now, but it's here in case you needed it and wanted some of the OAuth 2 features. So we're going to skip OAuth 2 app identification. And we're going to come down to a section called What is a Tweet Really? So we built all our authentication details. They're all bundled up into a single object that we can now use, right? And we bundled it into a thing basically called API, right? So what is a tweet really? Well, we ask this question because most people think that a tweet is, 100 and some odd characters, or maybe you have what's known now as an extended tweet, right? Maybe it's 280 characters. I'm going to run this section, this code block that says R equals API. That was that authentication-y API object that we created, .request. So it has a method called request, which is a special kind of function. It's just basically a mini program, and we're going to pass it some input. And the input we're going to pass it here is a little bit of a URL, right? Because we want a statuses show, right? So this is me filling in details for you. And then that number at the end of this is a tweet ID, right? So we're asking Twitter to give us a single tweet ID. This is part of the standard library. Doesn't cost you anything. You can ask for any single tweet ID, and you can ask for them all you want. Twitter will throttle you here in terms of the number of times you can ask for a single tweet ID per minute, but you could walk through the entire Twitter archive if you were able to get all the tweet IDs and walk through. It would take you a long time. So I'm going to run it. And you'll notice at the bottom here, this block, I asked it to print R. So show me what R was after you filled this out. Well, we see it's this kind of weird thing with a open angle bracket and object and then some weird hexadecimal thing. This is a memory location basically for where this is. If I want to interact with it, I need to ask it for something within it. So I'm going to use the text method. So if I scroll down a little farther, it says r.text. I'm going to run this cell block. Run this cell block, and what I get here is a really long string, right? And it starts with a curly brace, or it starts with a single quote, because it's inside a string here. And then there's a curly brace, and it says created at Wednesday, whatever, right? And if I scroll to the right here, there's a lot of stuff there. Like there's way more than 140 characters here. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that Twitter is giving us what is a real tweet, not just the body or the text of a tweet. So we need a better way to see this. And Twitter is giving us this object as a JavaScript object notation object. So in the next code cell, I'm going to import a library called JSON. It's pronounced JSON, and it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And I'm then going to parse the string that I got back here, this r.text, with the JSON method called load s. It looks like loads, but the s is for string. It's not meant to pluralize load. We're not multiply loading things. We're loading a string. And I'm going to load that into an object that I'm calling parsed underscore r. And then I'm going to print it. And I'm going to print it using the JSON dump s method for dump a string. And inside here, I'm going to pass it what I want to print on the screen. So that's parsed underscore r, which I've loaded as a JSON object now. And I can add some fanciness. So I want it to indent. So JSON is a nested kind of vocabulary. And so children of parents will be nested inside of, or below the parents. And I'm going to sort the keys, because as Twitter gives them back, they're not necessarily in alphabetical order. So it's going to be easier for us to find stuff. So I'm going to run this. And I'll get this little block underneath that's going to show me everything that was in that single long line, but now it's formatted much differently. And hopefully it's easier to read. And so that's why this is here. So now you can see a representative sample of the things that are inside tweets. And they are not just 140 characters. There's a ton of information here. So when was it created, right? Are there any hashtags involved in it? Is there any geographic coordinates attached? And you see for this one, the answer here is no. If there were, there would be further information under here, perhaps latitude and longitude information you can get. What's the ID of this tweet? Right? If we come down here a little bit farther, we see there's actually a key here called text, right? And here's what you might think of as being the actual tweet. And it says, along with our new hashtag TwitterBird, we've also updated our display guidelines, and it gives you a link for that, right? So this is a tweet from Twitter about some new guidelines and a new TwitterBird that icon that they created. So pretty banal tweet. Go further down, we've got a description. This is a description of who is actually posting here. So this is the real Twitter API as opposed to the fake ones. And some other information that's in here as well, right? So you can scroll through that and you can see it, and you can see that it's a lot. So this is a lot nicer to read. And so being able to work with JSON becomes very important if you're going to work with tweets and the Twitter API. So if you're not familiar with it and you need to scrape Twitter, you're going to have to get familiar with it. So once we see that it's JSON, JSON is really a dictionary. If you're familiar with Python, you're familiar with this. If not, I'll give you a quick 30-second summary. Dictionaries are key value pairs or bundles of key value pairs. And all this means is that you're able to declare a key or say the name of a key or ask for a key, and it will give you the value, right? So you're used to this with a regular dictionary. You want to look up the word cat. You say, what's a cat? And it's going to tell you it's a mammal and some other things about cats, however it describes them. So you give it a key, you get the value back. Our dictionaries are different from the Twitter dictionaries or JSON dictionaries because our dictionaries are alphabetized by default. These, they don't have to be. The computer can search them really, really quick. But once we know that they're key value pairs, we can ask for stuff. So in this next code block, I'm going to ask it I'm going to print tweet space body, and then I'm going to go into parsed R, and I'm going to ask it to give me, I'm going to pass it the text as the key, and it's going to give me back the value of that key. So this will be the new Twitter bird, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to do the same thing for the tweet ID and the screen name. So I'm going to run that. Right, and we can see now I can very quickly shoot in here and pull content out. So JSON can look really kind of messy and complicated, but once you understand what the keys are, it's very easy to ask for the values attached with those keys, and you can do a lot with them. So there's one other way to do this. This is the long way around. The faster way to get this nice formatting is in this very last code block in this section. Here, we're going to use Twitter API has a method called getIterator, where it's going to loop through all the tweets that are returned. And when it does this, it's going to automatically do the JSON conversion for us. We don't have to declare it specifically. So if I run this block, right, it makes the same request. And then we just run this getIterator. There's only one tweet returned in this list, so it just stops after the end of that. But you see we're getting the same thing, right? We're getting the tweet body, the tweet ID, the screen name. And I didn't put the declared user location, but I could have. So we can now get single tweets. We now know a little bit about JSON and perhaps how to think about what's in there. If you've never seen a full tweet before, I strongly recommend that you go back up to where we first explode that tweet out and you look through what's available. This is not everything that you could get in every tweet, but it's the bulk of it. So let's look at streaming now. And so on my screen, in the notebook I loaded up, streaming is currently a collapsed subsection. So I'm going to click on the left-hand side of streaming. There's a little arrow pointing to the right. So I'm going to click on that. And I'm going to blow this out. And so it's going to talk a little bit about streaming. And we're going to move down here quickly to this code cell. Now, before you run this code cell, please track the important here. The hashtag, or not the hashtag, but the string, the character sequence I'm choosing to search here is a popular one. I'm choosing it on purpose. I know there's going to be a lot of stuff. Here's where we can run up against that threshold. Twitter can kick us out because all of a sudden we're bumping up against, I don't remember if it's 1% of all the tweets that are coming out right now, or it's like 1/10 of 1%. But anyways, if you start approaching that and you pass that threshold, they'll just cut off your connection because they've got to serve a lot of information to a lot of people. And, well, they'll give you that, but you're going to have to pay for it, and we're not doing that right now. So what's going to happen in this block is I'm going to click on it. I'm going to count to 2 seconds, and then I am going to click the stop button, which is which is what the play button turns into when I click it. So I'm going to click here beside the track trump. I'm going to go 1, 2, and I'm going to hit stop. Right? If I don't, it's just going to run indefinitely. It's going to eat a ton of stuff, and it's just going to make it really long and hard for you to scroll around. So what we've done here is we pass it a term to track and to a variable called track term, and the term we're searching for is TRUMP. I then create a variable called R, which stands for my request, and I use the API request method. And here you can see a little bit of that URL has changed. I'm now, in statuses, I'm looking at filter, right, as opposed to individual tweet IDs. And I'm passing it a key called track, and the value I'm passing it is track term, which the line above made Trump. So I'm searching Twitter for Trump, and then I'm going to come down here to the bottom. You see that get iterator method again. We're opening up a connection to the API, and we're just waiting there. We're running through, we're getting the next one, getting the next one, getting the next one, getting the next one. And every time we get it, we print it on the screen. And in that print line, you can see that here I'm being fancy, and I'm just printing the text and the ID. Right? And if there is no text, which is possible, you can get some hiccups in here, then it's just going to go to the next item, right? Or it's just going to print the item itself. And so we get all sorts of Trump rallies, and there'll be all sorts of interesting language. And if you care about this stuff, well, a lot of underneath here, underneath the tweets, you're going to see something that says keyboard interrupt. This is Python saying, hey, you told me to stop. You sent me a command through the keyboard that said I shouldn't keep going. And so that's what the stuff is underneath. So you can now quickly filter and grab from the tweet stream. This isn't super useful unless you just want a quick sample and you're going to cut and paste from your screen here. What you're going to want to do is write to a file. So the next thing down is a subsection called write to file, and so I'm going to expand that section. Right. Here you'll notice it talks a little bit about a database and how this is a better option in the long term, but we're just getting started here, so writing to a file will be just fine. The next code block shows you how to do that pretty directly. You'll see the first two lines look very much like what we saw before. Excuse me. First two lines look very much like what we saw before, but the third line has opening a file, right? And encoding it with UTF-8. That's a helpful thing to do, particularly if you're going to try and run this notebook on a Windows system. So here you can write to, this is the write to file block. You see the third line down, we're opening up a file that we're going to call stream tweets. And so what's going to happen here is we are going to pull tweets down, and instead of just writing them to the screen, which we're still going to do, the very last line in this for loop is going to write a nice line out to a screen here. So I'm going to run this, and I'm going to stop it, right? So I'm just going to run it. I'm going to go 1, 2. I'm going to stop it because we're just doing a sample here, and this would just run forever. There's always going to be tweets about Trump for the next little while. And so the file I was creating here is called streamtweets.csv. I turned it on with the append option, so if I already have that file open, it'll attach new things to it. And if I come over here to the left, there's a little pop-up arrow, and if I click that, it brings out a whole lot of, well, it brings out a little menu set. So one of them is a table of contents for the notebook I'm in. Then there's some code snippets, which we'll ignore. But then the last option before the X to close this little pop-up window is files. And you'll see there's a file in here called Stream Tweets. You can also see that you can mount your Google Drive and other stuff here. You can also upload through this as well. And if I right-click on Stream Tweets, well, I could open it up and you could see it in there. We'll just set that aside for now. Sometimes I find it easier to download just given the Collaboratory interface, but all the tweets are being dropped in there really, really nicely. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to click that again. As you read through the rest of this section, you'll notice that it's going to talk a little bit about some lines and how to make it the case that line breaks inside tweets are handled properly. I'm not going to run this and demonstrate this for you. We're coming a little short on time, and I want to show you how to do the standard search and paging quickly before we move to questions. And so the trick here is this REPR function that's at the bottom of the, well, it's on the very last line of the last block of the code block of the writing to files section. And this takes those line breaks and doesn't allow them to appear as regular line breaks, and allows you to bundle it all up as a single string. So you're not losing them and not having your text file that you're outputting will have one tweet per line. It'll be much easier for you to process. It can be less of a problem when writing to a database, but we're not going to get to that here. Standard search, that subsection, I'm going to open that up here now. Right, there's more things reiterated here that I've already talked about. The standard search, the first code block, you can see here we're setting up a variable called search term. I'm going to pass in pizza. The other lines should look very similar, right, except now we're searching tweets, right, as opposed to filtering from the stream. So the URL that we're helping pass along here changes a little bit. And we've got the same sort of thing. I'm going to run this first block because I want you to see what's happening with that very last line, which is printing the quota. So I ran it, and you can see on my screen, it's also, there's a whole lot of pizza icons there, pizza emojis that are showing up here. And when I print my quota, it shows how much I still have left. So I'm going to run this again, right? And you can see the number dropping. So it started with 178. It's now 174. I've only run it twice. This tells me that there are others following along here that are using this workbook alongside me. So you get about 178 of these that you can pull like per 15 minutes, right? And this is in addition to, this is how they limit you with the standard API. Right? So you're going to want to track that, and I'm showing you how to track it here. So if you're ever like, why can't I get any more of these? Perhaps you're running up against that limit. There's some other parameters there, and you can read through this next section. I do want to show you paging, and that's where we'll stop for today. Well, actually, I'll talk a tiny bit about premium access and then paging. What's going to happen at some point is that you're going to need more tweets than the 100 tweets that Twitter will return by default. And to do that, you need to do paging. Paging with Twitter works by, well, they'll send you a whole lot of tweets. Each of those tweets will have an ID. What you then need to do is tell Twitter that you want to do this search again, but you want to search for things before this ID. And then you'll get another list, and then you'll need to pull from the very last tweet that they return the ID, and then tell Twitter that you want to do the same search again, but from things that are before this last tweet ID, and you can see this cycle gets set up. This library that we're using, Twitter API, handles this brilliantly. And so you'll see in this very first code block that instead of importing the Twitter API from the larger Twitter API library, we're going to import Twitter Pager. This function is going to allow us to do this, and it's going to handle it for us automatically. And so here I can search for the term pizza, right? And it will just cycle its way through. This is another one that you don't want to just have run indefinitely because it'll just eat up the quota and it won't work well, but you can run it. And so I'm going to click play here. I'm going to wait a second or two, and if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see that it pauses, and then it goes again. So the reason for this is the Twitter Pager functions that are going on in the background here are being polite. They're waiting a minute or two, not a minute or two, but a few seconds before initiating the next paging request, just so Twitter doesn't get upset and cut you off. And so all I'm printing out here are just the dates and the tweet IDs so you can see them. But that's the concept that's running in the background here for paging. And there's a little more advanced stuff, and you can read through that. Last thing you need to see is how to do this premium access. So I'm going to open up the section called 30-day. This will be the last one that we talk about here. I'm also opened up the premium access subsection as well above it. And so if you look in here, we're from Twitter API, import Twitter API. There's one further down that shows you how to do it with paging. We've got search term like we've had before, but you have two other things that are added here. One is the product, and the other is the label, right? So these have to be taken from Twitter directly from your account. So I'm going to finish here by going back to the Twitter developer page. I'm going to, you should see the Twitter screen, the Twitter development screen. I'm clicking on my name in the top right corner, and underneath the apps option is an option called dev environments. These are environments that you're going to create and you're going to give names to, right? So I've already created these environments. If I hadn't, you'd see an option here for search tweets 30 days for set up a dev environment. What matters here is the name that you give as a label. So I have 30-day testing, no spaces, title case capitalization. Going back to my notebook, there is a thing called product that has to be set, and that's set by Twitter because that's what you're searching against, the 30-day, but your label can change and you control the name of that label. So 30-day testing, no space, title case capitalization, so capital D, capital T is exactly what I have here. And if I run this, I can search the 30-day archive, right? I'm not paging, so it's just going to do one search. If I come back to my dev environment here, and I click on the dashboard, we can see now that I've done one request, right? And I've got about 100 tweets back on that run request for the word pizza. So in summary, you now have this notebook. You should have a strong familiarity for what's available to you from Twitter, and you should have some idea about how you might want to get it. And you have this workbook that you can actually use as soon as you get your own dev environment set up with the API keys and the secrets. So I'm done, and I'll open it up for questions. Let me turn off my screen share.
There were no questions in the chat window so far. So you can type your question or unmute yourself and ask via audio. I guess I'll ask a question if while we're waiting for other questions. So you mentioned that there are several different implementations of the Twitter API. I mean, there are third parties who wrote the implementations. Do you know if there's an API that does not have any limits, where you can do essentially infinite analysis? Wow.
Yeah, that's not. Yeah, it's the Twitter interface itself that throttles you. So not those third-party ones at all.
Okay. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And the reason I went with Twitter API no space as the library is because it lets you do the paging, and it does it beautifully.
Okay.
I used to use Tweepy, and I had to do it manually. It was awful.
Okay.
It was awful. Yeah. Yeah. So Twitter's throttling you absolutely. I see we got a question here.
Yeah. So I'm going to pay. There's no question. Somebody says thanks.
You are welcome, Andrea.
And so I'm going to paste the link to the page where the recording is going to be posted in a week or so.
Perfect. Perfect. And with that, can we paste a link to the notebook as well?
Yes, absolutely. I'll do it.
That'd be great. Thank you.